Great. So let me just say that I wish I was a grad student again, joining Stanford and listening, and this is a real treat, listening to Secretary Shultz and Secretary Perry, because they have insights and they have the experience that very few people have. And the combination of the two, I can say, is absolutely unique. So this is a real treat. Let me first say, just give you the little format. We will start with some opening statements. We'll have a discussion. And then later on, about the last half of this hour, we'll just open it up for questions. And it's really for you to have the conversation with the two secretaries out here. So let me start with Secretary Perry. Would you like to make a statement?
I'm going to talk briefly about how energy in general, oil prices in particular, can affect national security. I want to make this as an opening statement because I think it's not likely that your questions will broach on this issue, and yet it's one that's very important. And specifically, I'm going to talk about how $40 a barrel oil is affecting Russia, which in turn could affect the security of the United States. Why have I picked Russia instead of one of the other petrostates, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Venezuela? It's because Russia still has thousands of nuclear bombs, as well as the ICBMs and the submarine-launched missiles and the bombers to deliver those to the United States. Or, as a popular Russian journalist stated in Russian media lately, Russia is the only country capable of turning the United States into radioactive ash. Just think about that for a little bit. Just so no one missed that point, Russia has underway and is trumpeting to the world that they have underway a major program in nuclear arms building. They're building new ICBMs, new submarine-launched missiles, new bombers, the whole bit. It seems likely to me that the already one impact on the United States is that we will feel obliged to follow suit. And we're going to be off into a new nuclear arms race like the one we had during the Cold War. There's one side consequence of that from the United States point of view. The estimate of the cost of those nuclear arms in the United States is about $1 trillion. Your mind can't even grasp what $1 trillion is, but tell me it's a big, big number. Russia's nuclear buildup is only a backdrop to their aggression in Ukraine and its implied threat to the Baltic nations. Putin has justified his actions in the Ukraine many times by stating that he is taking it to protect the Russians living in Ukraine. Now, to one who grew up during the era of World War II and prior to World War II, that sounds chillingly like the statements that Hitler made about what he was going to do to protect Russians who were living in Czechoslovakia. His statement was followed first by the occupation of what they called Sudetenland, and then by the occupation of all of Czechoslovakia, and then finally by World War II, which ultimately amounted to more than 50 million fatalities. Putin has evoked his policy to justify his actions in Ukraine. That policy applies equally well to the Baltic nations, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. More than a third of the Estonians are Russian-speaking and are the children and the grandchildren of Russians who were sent to Estonia by Stalin after World War II. And those Russians occupied the jobs and the houses of Estonians whom Stalin sent to the Gulag. So naturally, there's quite a lot of tension in Estonia between the Russians there and the native Estonians. That tension could be aggravated anytime Putin desires to do so. So I think it's fair to ask, how do we get into this mess? So when Russia became an independent republic in the early 90s, it was gripped with a severe crisis, hyperinflation, unemployment, lawlessness, and political instability. Not surprisingly, many Russians equate that period in life with the virtues and benefits of democracy, because that was the only time that any Russian can remember they had anything like a democracy in Russia. When Putin became president, he caught a break. And I tell you, this is only a break, nothing he had anything to do with. Oil went up to over $100 a barrel. And Russia, as a great oil producer, was a huge beneficiary of that. That stimulated the Russian economy in very important ways and allowed Putin to deliver his people. One of the things he had promised them was a level of prosperity. So that was a very important development of the period. Now, at prices, so that's how we got started in this. But the question that comes from that then is, how does that affect Russia today? It's no exaggeration to say that Putin's power and his legitimacy has been tied to oil prices around $100. In fact, some economists have estimated that at $80 a barrel, Russia is about break even. That if the prices go higher than that, they accumulate a surplus. They accumulate reserves. If the price goes lower than that, they eat into those reserves. But for almost the last year, the prices have not only been lower than $80 a barrel, they've been a lot lower than $80 a barrel. On top of that, Russia has had sanctions imposed on them. So between the very low price of oil, between $40 a barrel oil and the sanctions, Russia's economy is in a mess today. And they're certainly eating into their sanctions. Now, from a security point of view, there's some good news. And the good news is there'll be fewer resources then to spend on nuclear weapons and to spend on other military expenditures. The bad news, though, and I want to emphasize the bad news, is that because this will threaten the legitimacy of power of this regime, it could re-stimulate a popular series of protests, such as they had a few years ago. And if that happens, Putin in turn could play his national card. That is, he in turn could re-stimulate actions in the Ukraine, more military action in the Ukraine, and he could initiate military actions in the Baltics. I don't have to tell you that not only is Ukraine a problem with the United States, but the Baltic nations are NATO members. And the United States and the other European countries in NATO are pledged to defend them if they are attacked. So this could lead the United States and Russia into some kind of a military confrontation. That's the potential bad news at the end of $40 a barrel oil. Opening comments, we can talk about that later. George?
Who wants to follow that? Let me out of here. Let me touch on some very different things. I'll talk about some lessons from experiences I had that are applicable today. In 1969, I was Secretary of Labor, and the President suddenly made me the chairman of a cabinet committee on the oil import program. President Eisenhower had thought that if we imported more than 20% of the oil we use, we were asking for trouble in national security terms. So we had a quota system. That was our energy policy. And we were bumping up against it. That was the reason for the task force. We had a very good bunch of people, and we said some things that we thought were obvious. Namely, the vulnerability was to the Middle East. The problem wasn't military, it was the turmoil in the Middle East. So we should keep our imports from that region down. Number two, we should have a storage capacity for oil, so we'd have an insurance policy against a cutoff. Number three, we should change the quota system to a tariff system, so we collected the rents, not the Saudi Arabians. And number four, since we knew more about the subject after we studied for a week or so than anybody else in the government should have some way of paying attention to this subject. It's a strategic matter. The report was published. The President thanked me, patted me on the head, and said, "Nice report." There were congressional hearings. Nothing was done. In 1973, I'm Secretary of the Treasury. What comes? The Arab oil boycott. At that time, and this was just about what we predicted, at that time, a lot of electricity was produced by oil. So Christmas lights were basically prohibited. Gas stations closed on weekends. Defense Department security was worried a lot about it. So our economy was busted up. Our security was a problem. It was a big, and people came in to me. There was no energy department. They would come into me and say, I have some ideas for what other things we might do. And I thought some were interesting and supported them. Well, pretty soon the price of oil went back down again and everything stopped. So I learned from that, number one, that if you're ready, as our task force had made us ready, and an opportunity comes, you get something to happen. If you're not ready, the opportunity will probably go away and nothing will have been done. So keep those points in mind. There's another point, however, namely, as history repeated itself and the price of oil went up, interest in doing something else would rise, and when it goes down, it would all stop. We've been on a roller coaster ride. I make that point because the price of oil has been high, and so there has been a response in terms of probably by now the largest R&D effort in energy ever. But now the price of oil is going down. So we have to watch ourselves that we don't lose that momentum. And it's keep your eye on that ball. Now, what could bring us down? Well, natural ether could, but we can do dumb things. Let me give an illustration. About 4 years ago, we brought here to Stanford, over at our Hoover place, 12 scientists from MIT who were working on energy and R&D. We had about the same number from Stanford. We had one from Berkeley. We had one from Livermore. We spent 2 days talking about game changers. And then we had the whole crew went to MIT a year or so later, and we had another session. We developed a little book, Bob Armstrong succeeded Ernie Moniz as the MIT leader, entitled Game Changers. We took our act to Washington, and I asked the Speaker of the House, Republican John Boehner, to set us up with a meeting of the Republicans on the House Energy Committee. These are people whose reputation is to be skeptical of all this. So we took a little group in there, scientists from here in MIT, and selling energy R&D was a piece of cake. It was easy to do. But as soon as somebody said, okay, now let's have we got a good idea, let's have the government go into business producing it, everybody is off the bandwagon, including me. So I say, be careful. One cylinder does huge damage. And what it damages is the whole R&D program as well as the government program. So restrain yourself. So those are some lessons. Then one final lesson. In the mid-'80s, I was Secretary of State then. In the mid-'80s, a lot of scientists were worried about depletion of the ozone layer. And there were, like now, some skeptics. They all agreed, however, that if it should happen, it would be a calamity. I had the privilege then of twice-a-week private meetings with the president, and we discussed this in detail. And he became convinced that the scientists who were worried were right. So we did something different from what we do these days. These days, if you have something you think is important and there are people who oppose you, you villainize them and you try to eliminate them. He did the opposite. He put his arm around him and said, okay, you have your opinion, but you do agree it would be a catastrophe if it happened. So how about an insurance policy? It's an interesting concept. you take insurance against the fire of your house. It's not because you expect your house to burn down, but just in case. So we said, take out an insurance policy. And when that became clear that we were doing that, so you had the government basically saying there's a problem here and we're going to do something about it. Places like Stanford and companies, their creative juices kick in. In this case, the DuPont company came up with something we could do. Not aspire to by 2050, but do. And so we were able to put this into effect, and finally it wound up with an environmental treaty called the Montreal Protocol, and it worked. As it turned out in retrospect, the scientists who were worried were clearly right, and the Montreal Protocol came along just in time. So that's the final lesson. Think about an insurance policy. So as we look at the scene today, there are the threats that Bill talked about that are all too real. But at least in my judgment, there is a threat of a warming climate. And we need to do something about it. And we have in place, and we want to keep it flourishing, a really tremendous amount of bright people of various ages, not only at places like Stanford and MIT, but all around, who are working on this subject. Very important to keep that going because developments will come. I'm familiar with one project that I hope will materialize. It's the ability to have large-scale storage of electricity. If we can do that, and I think it's maybe pretty close, that's a revolutionary development for wind and solar. Takes the intermittency problem away. But also, Bill, has big national security implications. Because all of a sudden, the cyber attacks, you'll have a little hedge against them. You'll be able to store and you'll be able to work from your inventory a little while anyway, while you get your power back up. So there are big opportunities here, but we have to watch ourselves politically and otherwise to keep this big process going and get the kind of results that are going to avoid the catastrophe that we can all too easily see coming. Thank you.
Right. So let me ask both of you that, obviously it's very hard to predict exactly what's going to happen in the future. But perhaps based on your experience, and given that the students out here are entering their professional life, they're grad students, and let's project ourselves 35 years from now, which is 2050. It's not that far away for you guys. What kind of world, in terms of the energy side, would you like to see? And what do we need to do, following up what you said, Secretary Shultz, what do we need to do to get there? Secretary Perry?
Well, in that time frame, the United States can be energy independent, and California can be, put another way, the United States will have ample energy, and California will have ample water. Those are two forecasts I make with great confidence that we can do that. Whether we will do it depends on actions we take between now and then, but then actions which you'll have something to do with. But technically speaking, it's quite possible to do both of those. Now, the technologies that it hinges on are well underway already, so it's easy to project them. High on that list is solar. Solar is already approaching grid parity. That is, you can generate solar now close to the cost of electricity on the grid, and the costs continue to go down as we go down the learning curve. So that's simply an extrapolation of where we are right now. We can imagine a much, much bigger role for solar, and certainly in the time frame you're talking about, that can make a huge difference. The second is biomass. If we can convert cellulosic material and lignocellulosic material into sugar in the simplest possible way. Then we have about doubled the resources in the world by doing that. To give you an example, there's about as much sugar in the, if you take a corn stalk, for example, there's about as much sugar in the corn cob and the corn stovings as are in the kernels of corn. But that all gets thrown away. So if you found a way of converting that, then you double the resources essentially. It can be used for many things. Food, but can also be used for energy. It gives you an economical way, for example, making ethanol. Ethanol can be easily made right now, but they're making it in sort of a stupid way with corn. And corn itself is an expensive food product, so that's starting off from the wrong starting point. So between solar and biomass, we're going to have a huge expansion of energy available to the world, and specifically to the United States, if we take actions which are now, you can now spell out what the actions are. We just have to have the political will to do them. Finding the water category. California has more than 1,000 miles of coastline. We've got water all over the place. The problem is it has some salt in it. So we need desalination. There's no great mystery about how desalinate. There are desalinators already deployed along, a few of them along the California coast. The problem is they're pretty expensive. So the water you get from desalination is substantially more expensive than the water you get by channeling it down from the Sierra Nevada mountains. So you have to find a way of doing that less expensively. The most obvious solution to that is solar again. Because as it stands now, about half the cost of a desalinator is the electricity that runs the desalination plant. So if you can replace that with basically free energy, basically sunshine, then you have a way of bringing the cost of desalination down too. So between those examples, the solar, the biomass, and solar applied desalination, we have the resources and we have the know-how to make energy surplus in the United States and to make water surplus in California. And you will be at the middle of your careers at that time. Some of you will have children sitting where you are right now, and so you should care a lot about what that kind of world looks like. But it's your actions that have to be taken to make that happen. The technology is there, the concept is there, but it has to be realized through real action and through political will.
Well, I agree with everything Bill said, but I have an idea for you, Bill, and then one thing to add. The idea is that when it comes to desalination or purification, the reason it's expensive is the energy has to push the salt water through a membrane. And if you could invent a membrane, and I think I know of somebody who has, that lets it through easier, you reduce the amount of energy needed to do it. And you can cut the cost of desalination and purification. There's a huge amount of water that is impure but can be purified, just as you can get salt out. And we can change the energy picture, the water picture, as you say. I think it's also important in this field to level the playing field. Make all forms of energy compete on an equal basis. How do you do that? Some forms of energy, like solar, produce no carbon. Other forms of energy produce considerable amounts. So when they do that, they impose a cost on society. And I think it's fair to say they should be made to bear that cost so that the playing field is equal. And the way to do that, and I've advocated this publicly, is by a revenue-neutral carbon tax. I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal on this, and I had as my fellow writer the late Gary Becker, who is considered the most conservative economist in the world. So it's not a nutty liberal idea, it's something that people have endorsed. I say, make it revenue neutral so that there's no drag on the economy as a result. The money gets back into the economy. You don't slow the economy down. You just change the structure of incentives and level the playing field among forms of energy. So I think if you did that, it would, and keep that there permanently so people know that that's part of the process, then you change the incentive structure and you get the kind of result you want.
So let me ask you about nuclear.
About what?
Nuclear.
Nuclear.
I think, when I gave the talk, there were some questions in nuclear. And I think a lot of people feel that it may be difficult to decarbonize without having nuclear. And the question is, do you share that belief? And if so, what do we need to do to have higher penetration of nuclear in our electricity system? Secretary?
Well,
oh, sorry.
go ahead.
The vision that I described earlier did not depend on nuclear. But it did depend on maybe 10 or 20 years to get there. And certainly we need, in the meantime, we need nuclear to tie to solar. So I think the minimum that we need to be doing is nuclear, find a way of sustaining our existing nuclear reactors for that time period. It gives us a breathing space to get the solar and the biomass developed to a level. It's not just enough to say we have the technology for the solar and the biomass today, we have to get them to scale. And that will take 10 or 20 years, and so nuclear provides a very good interim measure while that happens. In my vision of 2040 or 2050, we don't have to depend on nuclear. I'm not opposed to it, I'm saying it's not required.
We have a man at Hoover who is a retired 4-star admiral. His name is Jim Ellis. And he commanded a carrier that had a nuclear power plant on it. And after he retired, he was the head of a nuclear regulatory agency. The people who own nuclear power plants in the United States realize that if something goes wrong on one of them, they all pay a heavy price. So they've created their own regulatory agency, and they go around to each other's plants, and the people going know what they're looking at. If they see a problem, they get it fixed. And Jim ran that. So he's very familiar with nuclear things, and he is heading a little task force for us. We're going to have a larger meeting about it on small nuclear reactors. After all, he presided over one when he ran a carrier. He's also been in submarines. It's almost as though you can park a submarine in San Diego and use the power. But why can't we commercialize this? Well, there's a long ways to go, but still, it's obviously there. The idea would be you produce your nuclear power plant in a factory and you bury it. And you have enough fuel in it so it can go maybe 5 years. And it's also distributed power in the sense that it's not a huge plant with a big grid. It's smaller and it serves a restricted area. So if this could get going, it could be revolutionary. So we're doing everything we can to identify the problems and see how they can be solved. And the guy who's doing it is an experienced person who knows what he's doing. So I think this is something worth pushing. But as soon as you say nuclear, you are not only confronted with accidents, but you're confronted with weapons. And it was interesting to me, when I was in office near Kiev, there was the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Remember that? It was a huge disaster. And I was really interested that the first time I met with Mr. Gorbachev in the Soviet Union after Chernobyl, I found that he had asked the same question I had asked our experts. That is, what's the relationship between what happened at Chernobyl and what it would have been like if a nuclear weapon had been dropped there? And the answer is, it's not even close. The nuclear weapon is so much more damaging. It's a way of making you think of how awful these weapons are and the amount of destruction they do, and how they just don't belong in human hands. We occasionally have people from religious communities. The Catholic bishops came as a result of a talk you gave in Notre Dame, I think, Bill. The evangelicals have come, other denominations have come. And they all, at some point, somebody says, who do they think they are, God? Who thinks they should be able to push a button and kill 250,000 people or something? What is this? These weapons are unreal. So somehow or other, and Bill and I have been working on this together, we should, if we can find a way to reduce their numbers and get them out of the equation, we'll all be better off. But in the meantime, can we find a way to use nuclear power? It doesn't produce any carbon, and have it done in such a way that it's reassuring and people feel secure. That would be wonderful. And I have a hope, anyway, that the small nuclear reactor may be a way forward. It's got a ways to go, regulatory, manufacturing, and so on. But after all, we've been making these things for a long time for submarines and aircraft carriers, so we know how to do it. And it's promising.
So I would urge you to get ready with your questions, but I have one last question, a little futuristic. Any hope for fusion?
Yeah.
Well, I go,
Yes.
Yes.
When?
You mean in an industrial scale? We're talking the 2040, 2050 time frame. We might, over the next 5 to 10 years, I think it's 50-50 chance we'll demonstrate it. If we do demonstrate it in the next 5 to 10 years, then in the 2050 time frame, it could be an industrial scale.
So when they are in their prime of their career,
Yeah.
Secretary Shultz?
well, there's been hope for fusion for decades. At Livermore National Laboratory, they have a fantastic machine that is supposed to be, it's on the verge of producing fusion and has been on the verge for about 10 years now that I recall. But maybe they'll get there.
Very good. Yeah, go ahead.
I would just say one other thing. We've talked only about the supply side of energy, but we've already made significant improvements in the demand side, incremental reduction in the demand for energy. And over the time frame you're talking about, we can imagine new buildings being designed to be energy, new transportation, new cars, new trucks. You can imagine very significant 30-40% reductions in demand as well. And we need to focus on the demand side of this equation as well as the supply side.
I think that's a really important point, and there has been significant progress made. That's the cleanest energy there is, the energy you don't use. Incidentally, there's a power plant right near here that Stanford University built that's kind of a model of a power plant with very low emissions and very efficient. People ought to go and visit it. It's quite a sight.
I believe you guys got to see that already on campus. All right, let's open it up. Who has the first question? Ladies first. Yes.
Would you repeat your question? Especially that fan, I can't hear what's happening.
Hi, I'm Sai. I'm from the School of Education. Thank you for your talk today. I actually have a question about global politics and economics. For example, optimistically, if by 2050 the world was running on renewable energies, or at least most countries were, how would this affect global market prices and the probability and likelihood of war and conflict happening over energy or electricity? And does it encourage more international cooperation, or will more countries become insular, and will there be less cooperation because more countries are energy independent?
Right. So the question is, if you have, in 2050, if you have all renewable, which is local, what would it do to the economics and geopolitics, in summary? Right? What do you think will happen?
Be good for the economy, and since it's local, you would not be as dependent on faraway places. So probably that would be a positive as far as geopolitical tensions are concerned.
Well, I would only add to that that because it's local and because it's therefore not so dependent on disruptions, it lowers your vulnerability to cyber attacks, for example, on the utility systems.
I think in the electricity sector, we are fairly local. We don't, except for Mexico and Canada, we don't share electricity. I think the big challenge is how do you get transportation to be driven by local? And that's the electricity side, there's electrification, but we still need oil. And in the United States, at least we're going to be independent.
But Arun,
Yeah.
I have a home here on the Stanford campus. I have some solar panels on it. I've long since paid for them by the amount I've saved on my electricity bill. I drive a little Nissan Leaf around the campus. You know how much my fuel costs me? Nothing. What's not to like?
Question out there.
Hi, this is Hala from the engineering school. So we have enough current. Can you hear me?
A little louder. This fan is really loud. Go ahead.
Yeah, we have enough current tension due to oil worldwide politically, and we have enough wars going on. Do you see personally a disastrous future ahead of us if we consider nuclear power? Because advancing this technology means, on the other hand, having to advance nuclear weapon technology. So what's your comment on that? Does that raise extra tension? Is it gonna increase the tension worldwide?
So let me try to understand. The question was that with oil, there is conflict today around the world. If we go to nuclear power for electricity,
Yeah.
will there be a conflict as well?
Yeah, I see it as a disastrous, more disastrous conflict going on. If we consider nuclear, do you see it?
If the world
Yeah.
uses nuclear power.
Yeah, because advancing nuclear power would mean advancing nuclear weapon development in the same time.
Oh, I'll make one comment on that. And that is nuclear power in the hands of nations who do not have nuclear weapons open a risk of nuclear proliferation. That's been demonstrated in North Korea. It's been demonstrated in Iran. Although Iran hasn't gone to nuclear weapons, the issue which led to the great controversy and the nuclear deal had to do with the danger that Iran might use its nuclear power plant as a cover for making nuclear weapons. So that's just one aspect of the question you asked.
Well, but the point is, if you can enrich uranium, you can produce a nuclear weapon. The hard part is enriching. The easy part is turning it into a weapon. So that's what worries people about Iran. It has a vast capability to enrich uranium. And of course, any country that gets a nuclear power plant can reprocess the spent fuel into weapons-grade material. So that's another problem that people worry about. So the U.S. has had a policy for a long time, abandoned now with the Iran deal, but had a long time had a policy of drawing a sharp line between the technology of knowing how to produce a nuclear power plant and the technology involving enrichment and reprocessing. And if somebody's going to build a nuclear power plant that we help with, to make arrangements to bring the spent fuel back somewhere so they don't have it. But that process is breaking down very rapidly now.
Question up there.
Yes, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And since you have served in the highest echelons of American government, I would like to hear how you would evaluate this administration's energy and environmental policies. And also, are you hopeful that we will see American leadership in Paris this December? Because we did not see that in Kyoto.
How do you evaluate this administration's performance in energy? And what do you expect in Paris? negotiations on climate?
I think President Obama has been right to emphasize the importance of the climate threat and trying to do something about it. I think in tactics, for me anyway, it has not worked well. That is because there's a constant campaign going on. You have to remember, campaigning is an act of division. I campaign so you'll vote for me rather than you. I'm dividing myself from you. Governing is exactly the opposite. Governing is figuring out how we can find some common ground and work something out together. So we now have a situation where almost any issue that you name, there's a lot of division. And somehow I think we have to stop campaigning about it and start governing about it. As far as Paris is concerned, I'm sort of a skeptic of these big meetings in which people try to agree on something to happen by 2050. What matters is what you do today. That's why the Montreal Protocol was so successful. We had something you could do today. And one of the things I suggested actually to Ernie Moniz when he became Secretary of Energy, I said, why don't you go to make a deal with the Chinese? They're the biggest emitter, we're the biggest per capita emitter. And say, let's make a little deal where, first of all, we set aside intellectual property matters, we settle that so nobody worries about that. And let's identify all the possible things you can actually do and start doing them. And if we do that and we start really doing things and it's starting to work, then other people will want to do them too, so we'll say, welcome to the club. And start spreading things you do as distinct from things you agree to do by 2050, which I don't really have much hope.
Secretary?
I think President Obama's views and policies on both energy and climate change are good views. I agree with them fully. I think his accomplishments in this area have been very limited. I blame that not on his ineptness, I blame it on the fact that we've got a dysfunctional government right now that affects not only this issue, but many other issues as well. And for that reason, however well prepared we go into Paris, I think we're not going to get much out of it. But I blame that mostly on our dysfunctional government, not on the administration.
With the dysfunctional government, we have to, everybody is campaigning. All they do is raise money and campaign. When are you going to stop and say, you get elected to govern? Govern is different. For example, they're going to vote in Congress pretty soon on a continuing resolution. This is a gigantic amount of money. If it doesn't pass, the government closes and all that stuff. It is a cop-out by the Congress. The Constitution gives the Congress the power of the purse. You can't spend a dime as Secretary of Defense unless it's appropriated, authorized and appropriated by the Congress. So that's their job. And the right way to do the job is the old-fashioned way, where you hold hearings on sub-units of each cabinet department, and we discuss these things in operational terms. And you find out that that's not particularly partisan. It's operational, and it sets a different atmosphere. And if we go about the old-fashioned way of going about things, I think we'd see this atmosphere change.
Great. Question over there, or at the back. I'm going to come over here.
Thank you so much for your talk today. When you think about the carbon tax as one of the most efficient solutions to balancing the playing field, while as improbable as it seems currently, even if we were to implement it in the US, how do you extrapolate that, how do you extend that across the world to other large polluting nations like China and India and even the EU?
Question is, if you even if you have carbon tax in the United States, which seems unlikely right now, but even if you had that, how would you spread that across the world so you have some uniformity across the world?
Well, in the first place, if you can get it into effect in the United States, it has a certain exemplary quality to it. And you can argue, particularly if it begins to work, you can point to it and say, here's something that works. Incidentally, there is a revenue-neutral carbon tax in place in British Columbia, and it's been there for about 5 years, and it's worked quite well, I believe, and the income per capita in British Columbia has actually improved a little better than Canada as a whole, so you can't argue that it's messed up the economy. So you have something to point to. But you can also take a step by saying, we have a carbon tax here, and anything that comes as an import to the United States from some other country that doesn't have any such thing is going to get a tax put on it. So you give them an incentive by virtue of that to try to replicate the experience. So I think you can do certain things.
Secretary?
Well, I would have said the same thing, but probably not as well as Secretary Shultz said it.
Okay, you had a question over here, and I'm going to spread that around a little bit.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the talk today. It's been fascinating. My name's Dave. I'm with the law school, and I'm also reluctant to admit in energy circles that I'm from Canada, because Canada's not been a very fair player over the last few years. But my first question is whether or not you guys are willing to run for president. It might be too late, because we're in need of good candidates this year. But the real question is, if you could lead development of a bill aimed at facilitating a clean energy future, what would be the key 2 or 3 features that you would build into that bill? You've touched on a couple, but I'm interested in how you would prioritize that.
What would you prioritize in a clean energy bill if you were to structure that today?
I think the answer is easy. You'd authorize and try to set it up on a reasonably long-term basis. Significant, sustained, underline the word sustained, support for energy R&D. I think the R&D is much more effective if it's clear it's going to be sustained. It's not a one-shot thing. So I'd try to do everything I could about that. And then I would do my revenue-neutral carbon tax. And so you'd be saying to people, put a price out there, and then you compete against that price. And let the market figure out where it wants to go. But you put a price on carbon. So you make it significant to people to figure out how to do something that doesn't incur that price. So I don't think it's complicated. I think it's simple. But then you have subsidiary things like, I would look at something like the small nuclear reactor and really try to make a project out of it. What can we do to move this along and get it into reality? Among other things, let's have careful regulatory process, but let's not have a regulatory process that's just a big inhibitor of doing anything.
Secretary?
Yeah, a robust R&D program and a well-crafted carbon tax. And on your first point, I would never, ever vote for president for somebody as old as I am.
You'd never vote for what?
Anybody as old as I am.
For president?
Much less as old as you are.
Well, I'm about 95 years old. I'll be 95 in a couple of months. So I'm not ready for an 8-year term.
Yes. Come there.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm Sebastian Serra from the business school. I'd be curious, just hitting on the idea of a carbon tax, how should we transition to a world where we have a tax where a lot of the efforts that have developed today are really kind of more along a cap and trade mechanism, especially in California? And so do you kind of reverse those efforts and then implement the tax, or do you have both mechanisms? How would you guys envision that moving forward?
Cap and trade is really a tax disguised by those words. So it's politically a little more palatable. But it's not as good because you really don't know what the price is And the cap and trade systems, as in Europe, tend to get corrupted by offsets. And you develop all sorts of offsets that you can then go buy and offset the penalty you're incurring. And sometimes they'll have an offset from someplace you never heard of because they planted a tree or something. And it's been discouraging. So if it's a straight tax, it's not open to that same kind of corruption. And you know what the price is. Incidentally, in putting such a thing in, I would start small with a legislated increase. So people know that it's going to happen. It's not going to be an argument each year. So you know it's going to happen, but it starts small so people can get adjusted a little bit and you don't spring it on them. So I think from an implementation standpoint, I would start more with a legislated increase. That's what they did in British Columbia, and it worked pretty well.
Secretary? Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that most of the transactions in energy happen in the private sector. And for the private sector, it's very, very important to have predictability in the price. And so if the price is fluctuating, it's very hard for people to deploy capital and to plan. And I think that could happen in the cap and trade where a tax is predictable. And I think the private sector, I don't know how many CEOs have come and told us when we were in DOE, just give us a tax. And then we will adjust and optimize according to that. Over there.
Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Himanshu. I'm from the business school. The nature of climate diplomacy that we see today, in my personal view, has been shifted towards coal now. So people are talking about when does the coal consumption of China peak, when will the coal consumption of India peak, or EU and so on and so forth. So while another culprit of to that extent has been oil, and I think a bigger culprit. So as one of the biggest oil producer now, which is US, what do you think could be done on the diplomacy front to sort of move towards a cleaner future in oil? While a lot has been done in the coal sector, and China's coal consumption has, a lot of people say, will peak or has already peaked, and so will India. So India says by 2030 they'll peak. So what can be done on the same lines for oil? Thank you.
Coal and oil diplomacy, how do you do that? In the context of climate?
Well, you put a price out there. Actually, what's happening is, of course, natural gas has gotten much less expensive. So it's you wouldn't going to build a new coal plant today with the current technology and prices. So the marketplace is operating. But I think from the standpoint of appealing to coal votes, a carbon tax is a better way of doing it. But you're saying, look, you own a lot of coal, figure out a way to burn it that doesn't produce a lot of carbon. There are in existence today coal plants that capture and sequester the carbon. It's expensive. So at least they know how to do it. So can you get those costs down? The carbon tax gives a chance for people to do it. The regulatory approach just says they're going to wipe you out. So that's why my proposal would have better appeal.
Secretary. Okay, so you had a question out here.
Hi, my name is Michael with the School of Engineering, and basically I was wondering, you were mentioning about the national security concerns with regards to oil that we have today, and that in the future we would hope to have some way to store power from, say, wind and solar. But does that not bring about its own national security concerns as far as cyber threats, say recently from China that we've had issues with?
Cyber threats to our electricity system from China and other nations. How does that, right? Is that
Yeah, how does that affect the future that you envision with storing large amounts of power, not in the form of oil, but in the form of, say, batteries that could be would be controlled and managed by computer systems?
There are many ways of responding to cyber threats, Doyle, but certainly one of the most fundamental is decentralizing the distribution of electricity so that cyber attack has a very limited effect on the region. So going to standalone and decentralized systems. Secretary Shultz mentioned the small modular reactor in nuclear, for example. Certainly in solar, you can have a decentralized system. There are a whole set of political issues responding to cyber attack with counterattacks. But fundamentally, the best defense against them is a decentralization, I think.
Right. We had a question right here in Midwest. I call this the Midwest region. You're on about Illinois. Okay. Last question. This is the last question we're going to have.
Better be good then. Well, I'm from Germany, actually, not Illinois or so. My question is, nuclear weapons don't belong to human hands, you said. And how can you convince the people to decide about that? Not only demand it from other countries, but also let go of nuclear weapons in your own country, here in America, while the argument of self-protection is absolutely prevalent here.
This is about nuclear weapons and how to get rid of them. And you could not have asked that question to a better pair of people who have really thought about this.
The short answer is you cannot convince other countries to give up nuclear weapons as long as you demonstrate that they are vital to your own security. As long as by your actions you demonstrate. And that's what the position we're in today.
I had the privilege of being part of a process that reduced them a lot. And it started with President Reagan, who early after he took office asked the Joint Chiefs what would happen in the United States if there were an all-out Soviet attack on us. The answer came back, as Bill quoted earlier, it would wipe us out. Would he retaliate? Yes. Same thing. And I heard him say many times, what's so good about keeping the peace by an ability to wipe each other out? And he made a statement to a joint session of our Congress, basically an appeal to the Soviet people. He said, a nuclear war can never be won. We both wiped out. So it must never be fought. And he made proposals in arms negotiations to reduce them dramatically. The Soviet Union had 1,500 deployed intermediate range nuclear forces, INF forces they were called. We had none. And his proposal was that we should have, neither one should have any. People said it was a crazy proposal. But in the end, we got it. And he proposed that our strategic weapons be cut in half. And at the meeting in Reykjavik between Reagan and Gorbachev, they more or less agreed on both of these things. It wasn't consummated then, but it was pretty much, and eventually those things took place. So now, the number of nuclear weapons in the world is about a third what it was at the time of the Reykjavik 1986 meeting. The reason for the reductions is that the Cold War was brought to end, so the whole atmosphere changed, and you could do that. But what's happened is, when the Cold War ended, I think it's fair to say that with a lot of leadership from the United States, a security and economic commons had been built, and everybody benefited from it. So in that environment, you're willing to do things and collaborate on things. That environment has disappeared. The world is now awash in change. Uncertainty is everywhere. And this is not an environment where people are willing to give up something that they think has some potential value. So I think if we're going to get anywhere in the nuclear arena toward eliminating them or getting under better control, we have to be working on a world basis to try to reestablish that sense of a commons that we managed to have when the Cold War came to an end. And we're a long ways from that with the turmoil in the Middle East and the Russian statements that Bill quoted earlier here. So we have a lot of big diplomatic work to do to create an atmosphere where you can talk sensibly about nuclear weapons.
Well, we have come to the end of a wonderful discussion. Let's give a big round of applause, Secretary and Secretary Shultz. Thank you very much.